just to let you all know, I will not be able to see any sort of like written chat like as we're going through this. So if there's anything in there, I'm not ignoring it. I'm just not viewing it. And when we get to the end, we can answer any questions and have a nice discussion. I think that's some of the fun part is actually seeing, what are the issues or the opportunities that we all get to deal with when it comes to building brands, whether we're talking about large ones or smaller, newer brands. So you're welcome to put anything in the chat for those questions. I just won't be able to see it until we get all the way to the end, and then we can jump off for 10 minutes and really dive into some of those. So just to let you know. And we will hopefully be able to have enough time to run through those. So I want to respect all your time because you've been able to actually really be on time. So thank you guys all for that. And we'll actually get going. If people start still coming in, it's really not a problem because the first part of this is starting to get some of the ideas going, as well as looking at how we can really start to jumpstart any brand in 2025. And I must say, this is a pretty broad topic in terms of what we're looking at when it comes to jumpstarting brands. And I have to say, after working with a lot of brands worldwide, I've seen why a lot of teams really don't see a lot of results. I think one is that we work against the business objectives and processes, especially processes, when trying to do branding. And when I say, branding ideas, it really is how do you build the reputation of a brand over multiple touch points in order to have the right impression. The other thing that I've observed often is I think what we expect stakeholders to value in terms of branding is at the same level that we might value branding. So all of us have worked, within, different product teams, and we might be very focused on it, but our stakeholders also have other things on their mind, especially when it comes to, managing an entire business. And I think we also sometimes assume that, what the customer's goal is the same or naturally aligns with what the business goal is. And they don't always consider, what is that unspoken bridge between two, and how do we address that in terms of building a brand's reputation or overall system? I think the other thing that we do, and it's usually within best intention, especially if we're dealing with brands that, have regions or a global presence, is that sometimes teams can overcomplicate processes. And what this does is it makes decision-making a little difficult and also implementation a bit more clunky. And the last thing I've seen in terms of why, brand teams, whether they sit within their own team or within marketing or within kind of creative, I see that they also treat creativity as kind of a luxury rather than something that is a necessity. And I've seen that happen in multiple parts, as well as making creativity seem like something that's maybe unobtainable or only for the people who sit in the corner and do creative things. And that's why I've seen generally why teams don't see the results. We're not going to sit on this page too long, but I do see some colleagues that I used to work with back in the day. So a little bit of why we're here and who I am. I'm sure we're connected on LinkedIn, but if not, you can scan the QR code near my face. And I've founded a brand consultancy called Vernautical in terms of helping global brands with their reputation, presence, design, and systems. I really enjoy, and I've been able to amazingly be able to work with a lot of brands that are global, worldwide. And this is across multiple industries, whether it is kind of athletics, FMCG, or CPG in the US, B2B, hospitality, which is one of my favorite ones, health and beauty. And so really quite a range, which really helps to share different learnings across different industries. And I've been able to work for almost 15 years, or over 15 years in terms of, brand strategy and as a creative director. And what I'll share today is really how do you build and expand businesses? Because the creative is necessary, but the business aspect is always still there in terms of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I love encouraging creativity. I believe it has a huge need within businesses in different aspects, and also just building momentum in terms of brand growth and development, because momentum is just, it's great not only for projects, but to be honest, for us as people and team members to make sure things are always progressing. And I really try to talk about what's actually happening in terms of organizations versus like when we see like really cute, neat, easy brand theory that seems so obtainable, but for some reason seems difficult within global teams. And it's really that last point where I love having the discussion at the end. So please keep in mind, you can put it in the chat. I just won't see it right now in terms of questions as they come up, because we've all experienced the realities of building a brand, its reputation, and its design system. So I think the big question is like, why are we here on Thursday right after New Year's? Why should you jumpstart your brand right now versus maybe tomorrow? I found when your brand and your business opportunities are not aligned, going in different directions, you miss some opportunities, and you miss opportunities that could be pretty obvious if you had things in order. And that allows other people to keep going and surge ahead in terms of competitors. I've also found that if global strategies are a little too complicated, it really slows decision making, feedback, and it can create frustration within whether it's like regions and teams. And a lot of things I will discuss will be about, to be honest, people and managing brands, because it really is about how do you get everyone on the same page, and overcomplicating processes just makes it a little harder. I've also found that whether you're in a small brand with 3 stakeholders or in a larger brand with multiple across different regions, is that ineffective stakeholder management can fragment efforts, can duplicate efforts, and when it comes to your overall credibility, it's going to undermine it, which is really quite difficult if you're dealing, especially with more creative aspects of building a brand, its reputation, and design system. I've also found now that creativity is a driving force in terms of bringing new ideas into the business, and creativity is quite broad in terms of how you think about something differently, or a resource, or a way of doing things. And if you're trying to manage everything internally, and I've done this myself, without some sort of external support, ideas, and perspective, this can not only waste resources, but also limit impact. So that's where I find making sure that you curate the right team internally and also externally really helps. And I've worked on both sides, whether it's like internal or agency side. Now, what I've also observed in terms of jumpstarting brands now is that generally the rules of branding, they're changing, evolving, and we also get new challenges as things start to change and evolve. And for everyone that's joining in now, we are just at the beginning, so we're really going through why jumpstarting now. I think a decade ago, which sounds a long time ago, but if we say it as 2015, it doesn't sound as long, is that standing out with striking visuals, something clever, something a little bit new was enough. But unfortunately, we've all figured that out. And the market has become oversaturated. Audiences are like, I'm over this. And it creates disengagement. And we all see this as consumers ourselves, I guess as also competitors ourselves in terms of messaging. Brands need to really rise above the noise, both within, the entire market as well as especially within their industry, to show value and to really foster connections. And yes, I will say things like authentic, but I really mean things that will not turn on the BS meter in terms of your customers and really seem like something that fits within the context. And when it comes to brands, if you don't have some sort of operational system in place for scaling brands, especially across global teams, it is going to be very difficult and inefficient, and you will have duplicated efforts. And to thrive, for a brand to really grow and evolve, both from a consistency perspective as well as just from a creative perspective, brands need to be integrated across teams, regions, and touch points, because much like, say, customer experience, brand is the entire impression that someone has of your business across, everything from, sales to when they're going into marketing, and of course, using the product itself, as well as afterwards. So that's, I think, one of the challenging things about branding as we think about it in maybe specific aspects of it, like a logo or a positioning, but then it really gets implemented and executed across multiple touch points. So that's a lot of words, but what we're going to walk through is, like, how do we start reframing this? We're not where we were in 2015. Things are complicated. So what are the things that we need to do to reframe the issue of jumpstarting brands? And there are three things we're really going to look at. Then we're going to kind of re-look at it afterwards, which is focus. How do we focus down? And I am so sorry I had to use synergy, but it really was the best word to use in terms of the way of bringing together efforts. And then we're going to look at momentum. Now, when we look at the first one, which is focus, I found that a lack of simple goals can really lead to kind of confusion and weak outcome. And this idea of simplicity and streamline is going to come through multiple times. But we're kind of going to dig into it and see why, especially when it comes to creating something, again, across multiple touch points. When you have strategies that have excessive detail, it can be difficult for teams to execute against and to also create against. And that's always important for me, is how do you set something up for people to be creative? The other is, when we look at certain objectives with the brands, we don't always consider the regions, if you're looking at like a larger global brand, or even, the regions within certain countries, what their realities are. And what this can do is lead to inconsistency in messaging, as well as just experiences that are fractured. And if you're trying to build more of a global presence, this can be a bit of an issue. And I think the thing we always have to ask ourselves, if we feel like our brand goals are evolving with the business, or are we separate? Are our teams really contributing to what the business is trying to do? Like, really contributing in terms of our goals. And I think the most important thing is, again, whether you have a team of 2 or a team of 20, is, can your team really actually articulate your brand goals and your purpose clearly? Or are they kind of left trying to connect the dots or see the big picture? And I really like to compare this to a puzzle, one that you have not looked at the box and you know what the photo is, and you just have all of these pieces. And that's where it can become, difficult when people don't see or know the big picture and interpret it for themselves. Synergy, which is just one of those words that just had to come in the presentation, I found that if teams are misaligned and their efforts are not aligned, and stakeholders, you really can get resistance and really just a little bit of inefficiencies in terms of executing against creating that entire brand and reputation. And those fragmented efforts are things that can undermine progress. You can get a lot of duplicate work across regions and teams. I'm sure you can think of times when you've been working on a project and you find 6 months later someone else is working on the same project. You ideally would want that not to happen, even though it still will come up, in terms of the business. As someone who's been a creative, and I know a lot of people on the call have been, in different aspects of creating things for a business, is that when you solely focus on execution without trying to teach, like, in the process, it can make things hard to work cross-functionally. Again, people aren't thinking about branding as much as you might be, but how do you connect those dots for others? And I think the question we always have to ask ourselves is, Are your teams reacting to kind of short-term crises, which of course happens? It's the beginning of the year. We're hoping it doesn't, but it will. And are those with ad hoc branding efforts, or do they have some sort of kind of long-term, vision or impact? I think the other question for us to ask is there really a clear understanding of how a brand's efforts contribute to the overall success? I think the one thing that a lot of us have dealt with is how do you show or prove that, because there is both a short-term and a long-term aspect of building a brand system, its reputation, and also evolving it, because it will definitely evolve over time as well as within different contexts, whether it's different regional contexts, portfolio changes, or competitor and business contexts. And in terms of another analogy, I do look at this like a symphony. When you're playing one piece, everyone has different sheet music, but it's not different sheet music from different pieces. It's all the same one, and it really comes together. And that's why, honestly, synergy really was one of those words. We're all doing efforts separately, but they're coming together. Now, in terms of these last of these 3 points, then we'll look at how do we do this a little bit better is momentum. And that, to me, I would love that to be a word of the year, because I feel like that's so important in terms of brands, which just, to be honest, the work just, it doesn't end. Like, you'll solve one problem and create a new one, and there'll be new challenges. But if we overcomplicate strategies, it's hard to maintain action, and action just helps us feel like something's happening. And that's really important in terms of morale. And when it comes to morale, really one of the important points is if we compare our brand progress, our team, with those of larger competitors, it can be a little disheartening. When it comes to comparison, inspiration is great, but not all of us have, 100-person team. It might be a team of one, there might be a team of 10 doing a lot. I also found creatively, when you overload teams with very rigid, overly detailed brand guidelines and don't put them within some sort of context or instruction, especially from a creative perspective, it can be more about adhering than creating. And there have definitely been times I've worked with agencies and said, please just ignore the brand guidelines for the first phase, just so you can really think as expansively as you can, and then we'll adhere to guidelines at some point. The other part is that we assume that maybe others understand the value of brand work, and we have to ask ourselves, are we helping people connect the dots? Everyone is busy, from small teams to big teams, and we're not always able to connect dots ourselves. And that's why we just have to ask ourselves, how well are we communicating what this means? Because branding can be a little vague when it comes to our other stakeholders in terms of its understanding, mainly because it's changed over the years and how we use it. And I think the other thing to ask ourselves with processes is, are we trying to maintain momentum, or are we trying to build a process, or maybe overbuild a process? And I like to compare this to, windy roads. Sometimes they are definitely needed in terms of getting over a challenge or over a mountain, but other times they're not. We just have to consider, have we built a windy road for a purpose, or maybe could we simplify a bit? Luckily, processes are a little easier to simplify than windy roads that we actually come upon, and we have that chance to do that because all work within brands and teams are always with the best intent, but sometimes we have to take a step back and just see, like, is it actually working? Are there ways to improve it, especially for our teams? Now, before we go into Reimagine, I just want to reiterate, please, if questions come up, you can keep them in mind, or definitely put them in the chat, because it's something that we will go through at the end, because we all are dealing with different questions on branding, whether it's more from creating brand systems. It could be, how do you look at this from a product portfolio perspective, or how you help with certain challenges that the business might have. Now, 3 things again, but we're going to look at a different way of reimagining this process. How do we, jumpstart brands in the way that works? And we're going to look at, how do we clarify what we're doing in terms of goals? How do we really activate those goals across, multiple teams and touch points? And then, because Streamline is a big one for us. How do we actually streamline our efforts? What I've noticed when it comes to clarify is that if we do simple directions, it really helps to align teams and guide decision making. And this is important for all types of teams, whether their focus is much more about the marketing side of a brand or the creative side of a brand. And I have a lot of comments in terms of core brand purposes, but we really want to make sure that we are able to say them in a way that is memorable and perhaps a little non-jargony in order to unify efforts. And we have to really understand, what does each word within that brand purpose really mean? This helps not only in terms of aligning from a strategic perspective, but also from a creative perspective. If we say things like it's easy, what kind of easy are we talking about? Is it efficient? Is it quick? Is it straightforward? So also knowing what those words really mean helps to create certain types of metaphors that people can take further, especially within, whether it's like written creative work, visual creative work, or across different services and touch points. I think the other important thing is to look at, how do we co-create priorities with our stakeholders? Again, stakeholder of 2, stakeholder of 20, everyone still has their perspective and input. And how do we make sure that we can really bring that in early on, and that really it supports that year's business objectives? I've seen when I've been on teams that we want to do so many things, but it's really important to narrow it down, because whatever that is will not only change, but also evolve as the business learns and evolves over that year. And the most important thing is, like, how do we use research to identify and really bridge that gap between the business goals and the customer goals? And how do we actually mention that? The customer goal is X, our goal is Y. What are ways that we can kind of address both, or make sure that we're really trying to evolve the goals of both? It's because it's not just about a business, it's not just about the customer, it's about both. A lot of times we might say customer centric, which in some decision making makes sense. But in other decision making, it needs to be the realities of what the business is going through and what they're trying to do. And so I think sometimes we don't always mention that bridge. And the last one being is, like, how can we simplify or even design strategies so that they're easy for teams to follow? And how might we do that? Are there ways of designing documents, how we communicate them? What are the key messages, and can we make them as memorable as the things that we are marketed to as customers? Because we're all busy with different projects, and I think that's what makes branding especially difficult, is that there's so many aspects within branding and what you can do to build it, whether it's more, from a marketing perspective or even from a service perspective. And when it comes to this idea of kind of the brand and the business and your customer, it's really understanding that there are different overlaps of the brand story and customer story, what you can see over on the right in terms of diagrams, and there are just not overlaps in certain aspects. And it's really those overlaps that can help you connect the objectives of both together. And this can be anything from shared histories, whether it's a certain aspect of identity, also aspirations. What are the challenges that as a brand you're going through that relate to what are the challenges that a customer is going through? Community and connections. So how you connect over different touch points can be different things in terms of what the brand story is and what that customer story is, and that really is identifying it. You don't need to be doing everything all at once, but looking at when you're in the right place, when to use it. And just to let you know, I won't be able to read any sort of comments as we're going along, but please put questions in the chat and we will address them as we get to the end, because I would love just to hear what you're going through. What are your specific problems in terms of creating, activating, evolving brands, because they are always evolving, whether it's because they have to or because it's just what is going on in terms of the overall market context. Now, how do we activate brands? How do we involve stakeholders early on to create collective action? And that's really what I look at. We mentioned a lot of times, oh, teams are in silos. Unfortunately, that is the reality, but there are ways to kind of build bridges as well as design systems, processes, and strategies a little bit better so that you can kind of communicate through those silos. The big thing for me is like, how do you focus on branding strengths that also align with your brand's maturity, like what your team's ability is and your internal goals? Going back to that point of comparing to competitors, it's good to get inspired, but don't get discouraged, is that every brand is at a different maturity level. I've been at brands that were really established. They've been around for 100 years. You're really kind of evolving the brand. The teams are really established. But then you might be going into, new brands, whether it's large brands over, kind of portfolio brand, creating something new, or startups. And I've worked within kind of both environments, and you realize that you can't compare yourself to the 100-year-old brand. You're at a different maturity level. You have different teams' abilities at that point, and you really have to focus down of what can we do this year to get toward a long-term goal. And I know we all want to do awesome things, but sometimes it takes years to first do the boring things that you might need to create in order to create that foundation, and also just stability. Sometimes creativity comes from a sense of having other things done and stable before really trying different things. So how do you create that space, which might take, you might have thought it would take a year, and then it takes 3 in terms of getting to those goals. I also found piloting changes on a small scale really helps before kind of full implementation, not only to understand, does the idea actually execute well, but does it work? And this can be anything from, when we look at certain campaigns, as well as certain, services or different business models that might achieve a certain brand or business goal. And I think the other thing we have to ask ourselves when we're building a brand, its reputation and visual design system, is there a way to really leverage consistency as a baseline, but make sure that we still focus on creative ways to move the brand forward? And how can we do that? They are a little bit of different mindsets in terms of adhering to guidelines versus like, how do we start to think about this differently? Maybe how do we ignore some of the guidelines that we've done in order to think of different ways to, to talk to our customers, to instruct on what a product is, to help people understand how they can implement this into their business or into their everyday lives. I think we also have to ask ourselves is, when it comes to the business storytelling, is it something that we can leverage across, multiple teams? Every brand is a business and has these amazing stories. This is something I've especially seen within B2B, where really who's working there, the employees, their expertise is really actually quite interesting and can connect and create trust and reputation with people that they're working with. B2B is one of those areas that's really broad, but like is one of those areas that has so many great stories, but doesn't always yet tell them. And they have a lot of opportunities, especially when it comes to the business storytelling that we might see. And when we look over to this diagram, why simple ideas really help in terms of activation is that it's going to go through kind of three stages of interpretation, or 3 stages of maybe difficulty. Your core idea is going to go through stakeholder input. It might go through a regional interpretation, and then it's going to go through creative execution. So when you have a core idea that is simple and understandable, it's able to evolve and develop and hopefully flourish when it goes through those different stages versus going diagonally. So really how you start to frame that strategy really helps. When I've worked with brands like Shimano, we had to look at, what was that core idea? And we found that the core idea, which in a way can also be kind of a universal truth, especially when it came to that brand, was they focus more on technicality than perhaps the emotional aspect that people would get from having the adventures, whether it's cycling or fishing, with their products. And that truth of we all want to adventure, how do we start to use that and let it develop in different ways? And that was something that we looked at for an experience center. And that was just more of a cultural thing in terms of the brand, but but there's always a potential story that you can tell from that business. But it might just be a different way of telling it depending on the context and also just what we know about that brand over time. There are certain times where being functional makes sense and other times it doesn't. And we've talked a lot about simplify, and we'll get to this spiral of brand vision on the right. But if we simplify processes, it really helps to remove barriers and to build momentum. And this is something that we can look at as design. To me, process design is as much design as anything, as how do we simplify and clear up workflows to eliminate bottlenecks and accelerate progress. Now, in terms of streamline, there are times when friction is good, and that really depends, again, on kind of brand maturity. If you're really trying to establish and a brand has been really inconsistent, then you might need to make a little bit more friction. But if you want something to run and to see how something might execute across different regions, then you do want to remove a little bit of barriers. We should be, if we're managing teams globally, we should hopefully be seen as partners versus like the brand police. I think the other thing is like, how do we look at flexible design approaches that really work in real world business settings? I know as a creative, we want to do crazy stuff because that's just, we see the potential. And I think we all have seen the potential within brands and businesses that we worked with in terms of different ways that they could express themselves or connect with different customers. But it really is, how do you make this something that would actually work for teams now, where they are in the maturity level, how big the brand is, what their goals are. I think it's also a question of how do we make moments for teams to work together without too much unnecessary friction. Of course, there's always going to be friction, but are there ways that we can find to connect? I've actually found in terms of silos, some of the best ways are finding people who think like you within different teams or have a perspective that really starts to grow what you're trying to do within brand. And that can be anyone from, say, product to even sales. And those kind of even just individual conversations are a good start. I think sometimes when we think about collaboration, it needs to be like some big event and all that. But actually, to be honest, a lot of conversations, like individual conversations, can be a way to do that. I actually, when I started as a creative, I used to look at sales and I didn't understand. And then as I kind of developed more, I just saw that they're really on the front line in terms of talking to people, and they can be amazing in terms of discussing what's really going on, what's really on people's minds, and that helps in terms of business storytelling. So everywhere, whether it's sales, research and development, and even different aspects of marketing, that can be a great way to actually just start that collaborations, just individual conversations. I think the biggest thing is like if we're implementing a brand is how do you consolidate tools? So there's definitely a difference between like tools and guidelines, but how do you make sure that you have tools in one platform so it's easy to implement, whether you're dealing with like internal or external stakeholders? And this can be anything from actual, SaaS platforms to even using 365 in terms of creating websites. So how do you start to consolidate tools just so it's easy for people in order to implement brands? And that just makes your life easier if you are someone who's building one. And if we go over to this spiral of brand vision, it really is how do you start to create that momentum from your brand vision being the center? And hopefully it's something that kind of grows and moves itself over time. And that's how I like to think about processes, because there are times you want to control process more, and other times you're going to open it up. And with a brand vision, you're really trying to identify certain aspects in terms of strength, brand strengths, kind of testing new ideas over on the left of that diagram. Of course, maintaining consistency might be needed in terms of a business or brand goal, especially if reputation is becoming an issue because everything looks a little different or sounds different. And then it really is, how does that start to spiral into, not out of control, but spiral into its own thing that people can really take it and run with it, especially when it comes to expand creativity and amplify storytelling. I think actually a number of us have been on global and regional teams, and when you're able to as a regional team, take something from global and run with it. It's really fun. And I would say on the global side, it's actually quite cool to see where people take ideas. And you want to allow ideas to do that, whether you're talking about campaign or you're talking about more services and touch points, because of course, all cultural contexts will be a little bit different in terms of executing something, whether your brand is more about like identity or like a much more functional aspect. And I think it's because and we're all customers, that we are already overwhelmed with new ideas every single day. I am sure even during this presentation, there's new ideas, things around. You could look up and you're going to see new ideas all around us. And when brands offer value and they offer clarity, it helps to cut through the noise. And that's usually the hardest thing that we're all doing is cutting through the noise. And customers seek authenticity, which really just means something that makes sense within the context. We all intuitively can identify when something is BS or not without even thinking that hard. And that's what I mean in terms of authenticity. It really is appropriate, and it is this brand or business has the ability to say it. And we'll quickly dismiss anything that won't feel connected or won't feel like it has that continuality that we would expect. Um, and we also prefer brands that hopefully simplify decision making with clear, realistic solutions. This is, whether it's for a customer, within FMCG or CPG of choosing a product off the shelf, or it's, a business that has to tell the story of a service across everything from procurement maybe to the CFO, is that if you can make decision making clear and easier, it helps. And what that might mean could be different. Everything from something that's functional to more of a, I would say, emotional or an aspect of your belief system. And I think the thing we have to also ask ourselves is that are our experiences and messages really bridging the gap between your story and the customer story? Again, kind of going back to the overlapping diagram of different ways that you can do that. And those might change depending on, the business, even the time of year and the region. And the reason why, looking over at this brand positioning flower on the right, which sounds completely ridiculous, but again, easiest way to illustrate this is that we're overwhelmed because what your brand is, its positioning, its vision, is going to execute and impact kind of many, if not most teams, because it's going to drive both internal and external behavior. Everything from sales at the top all the way to product, kind of HR, brand design, because it also starts to encompass like how do we actually act as a business? What does that mean in terms of our decision making, and how is it something that becomes external? For any of you who've worked on customer experience now or in the past, it's very similar to the idea that customer experience is both employee experience as well as customer experience, because how things work will always be reflected in the brand itself or in execution. And that's why whenever I see something that's really creatively executed well, I'm like, wow, how did they organize their teams to be able to do that? Because that can be the hardest part. So here's a system that I like to use in terms of reframing how we do this. And the three stages are reframe, reimagine, and rev up. And when it comes to reframe, is how do we ignite a different idea in terms of brand positioning and that potential of a brand? I think every brand has a potential. And how do we take the pulse of what is actually going on in terms of context, also in terms of customer and our business? How do we really take that pulse? When we start to reimagine what maybe a brand position could be or processes, how do we do sprints to really find that quickly? Again, really about building momentum and start to make sure that we position it in the right way. Again, kind of design the strategy and the ideas and even the language of that well, so it's just easy to understand. We can have the detail, but we don't always have to have all the detail up front. And it's really also about revving up. I think one of the issues we might have with brands is we don't think about implementation a little bit earlier, the reality, and that really helps to frame things in certain ways, to create certain, whether it's metaphors or say systems and tools to make it easy to rev up at the end, which is how do you kind of outpace hopefully competitors within the market, and how do you boost those efforts over time? I really am very big about momentum because it just helps, especially when it comes to teams. We're all people managing brands. They're not being managed, by robots or anything. And being able to feel like your efforts are moving towards something really helps. And just a couple of pieces of advice, and we'll get into this kind of molecule of status quo, but I think, you know, we talk a lot about best practices and status quo, but it actually is pretty important to challenge status quo. And that really is not by being bold or being brave. It's really about understanding market realities and really what the customers need at that point, because the answer will be there if you can uncover and align it. It's also making sure that your brand is aligned kind of with connecting on an emotional level and that helps when it comes to loyalty and understanding. We say a lot these things like, "Oh, emotional," but it really is that you're acknowledging what people are going through as they're, interacting with a brand. And I have to say, function is emotional if any of you have had a computer that does not work. And as we look at implementing a comprehensive brand strategy, it's how do we make sure that we prioritize being able to work quickly and maybe flexibly, as well as bringing in new ideas. And that is going to be different per team. Like we're not always going to be innovative, and you have to define what innovative means for you. It is one of those words that people throw around, but defining that for your team on that day, on that year is very important. And I think the big thing for me is being able to kind of ask the dumb questions, and that really helps for creating clarity. There have been many times we've all been in meetings and we're like, but what does that word really mean? And we really need to be able to define that because that's what we're going to use to really execute against. And when it comes to status quo, why it's so important to keep challenging it, especially as a lot of us have been in this industry for years or even decades, is that status quo at the top, it becomes best practices, which some of those are legit and some of those should be questioned. And those should be challenged by doing something a little bit different or quote unquote innovative. And that then turns back into status quo. So we always have to kind of reconsider what is status quo and what is a best practice and say, is that still the case anymore or not? And that's where there's that is very fun opportunity when you can challenge that. And that's something that I've seen, working across teams is I've been able to work with Reckitt in terms of their B2B business, which was pretty new from a global perspective, to have more of an authentic direction and enable multiple teams, which a lot of that was kind of asking ourselves what was the status quo, because there's just many bigger players in B2B than Reckitt was or is. And also, I've also helped to successfully relaunch Regent hotels, especially from their guest experience, really helping to expand their global footprint. And I'm always looking at how do you elevate brand and customer experiences, whether it's been through B2B SaaS platforms within logistics and also with investment, or of course, like larger teams in order to really sharpen positioning, much like I mentioned with Shimano, is how do you sharpen that position with that experience to further the brand and its mission. Also help to relaunch Clinique retail in China by really looking at how do you make this regionally relevant, because at least within beauty, the West is best doesn't really work. Now, in terms of looking at positioning power up, I think it's something that people are missing. And if we were to work together, and one of my methods is really looking at 4 things. How do you enhance existing strengths and allow for that authentic transformation within teams? How do you make sure that when you're working on repositioning or rejigging an aspect of your brand, how do you create an action plan that really looks for key opportunities and quickly identifies them? How do we look at collaboration in the realistic way, not in the whole idealistic way of collaboration, to make sure that we can really look for top ideas of how do you differentiate a brand, and differentiation can come in multiple aspects, both of how you position as well as how you communicate. And again, when it comes to helping different teams with, powering up the position, is how do you do that ongoing support, because implementation and creativity and how it comes to life is to be honest, the hardest part. Like strategy is the fun part. There's one thing I would want to offer today, just, as an idea of how do you improve your positioning, is an offer that includes an Ignite session in terms of identifying those key growth opportunities, really having a pulse check in terms of what's going on with the brand and business to look at how to deliver measurable insights and strengths. How do you really create a differentiation strategy and do a sprint to identify that? Because again, differentiation can be so many various things. And how do you identify those top approaches for your brand and business at that moment, that year? And how do you make an implementation plan that starts to boost that, and a map that is a tactical 90-day launch plan, and also offering kind of ongoing support and guidance to ensure a successful implementation? Because I also believe that when it comes to boosting a brand, is that a powerful positioning statement or big idea really helps in terms of both credibility internally and externally. And also one thing I really like to use is a customer insights toolkit to enhance the understanding of customer needs now and what you might need in the future. Because we all in the business have insights. Usually the hardest part is identifying them and where we have those gaps. And if we do a power positioning together, it's for €9,000 per month. And it's just one example in terms of working together, because I completely believe in strong ideas that really can implement well in terms of across the business. Now, that was a lot of words. So I'm glad that you've been able to join me. We do have 12 minutes, which is pretty good in terms of doing conversations. If you want to book a call with me, because again, we're going to be able to discuss general questions in the last 10-ish minutes. But if you're like, hey, I just have stuff on my mind and some more specifics, definitely book a call. You can use this cute little QR code, or of course, we can get in touch. And what I want to do is kind of jump off this train of monologue and also just see what some of your questions are in terms of brands. And I'm going to jump into the chat and see what has been going on, because I see it kind of popping up as I'm presenting.